The year was 1815, and London was a city caught between the dying embers of the old world and the roaring soot of the new industrial age. In a narrow, fog-choked alleyway near Aldgate, there stood a shop that seemed to defy the very passage of years. Its sign, weathered by decades of acid rain and coal smoke, simply read, "Thorne's Horology." Behind the frost-patterned glass window lay a graveyard of time. Brass cogs, silver escapements, and pendulum weights scattered like the bones of ancient giants. This was the domain of Elias Thorne. To the neighborhood, he was a ghost who happened to breathe. He was a man of 70, though his eyes possessed a terrifying clarity whenever he peered through his jeweler's loop. Elias didn't just fix watches, he performed surgery on them. He could hear a microscopic misalignment in a heartbeat, a talent that made him a legend among sea captains and aristocrats alike. Yet, for all his mastery over time, Elias lived as a man outside of it. His shop was a vacuum of silence, broken only by the polyrhythmic ticking of 100 different clocks, each beating out a second that Elias himself refused to acknowledge. He wore the same charcoal-stained tweed vest every day, a garment that smelled of whale oil and aged mahogany. His hands, gnarled like the roots of an ancient oak, never trembled. Not even when the cannons of the Napoleonic Wars had echoed in the distance, nor when the city groaned under the weight of poverty. But there was one thing that could make his heart falter. In the very center of his workshop stood a grandfather clock that was an anomaly. It was carved from African bloodwood, so dark it looked like solidified shadow. Its face was a haunting void. No Roman numerals, no golden hands, just a smooth, polished surface of wood. This was the Aethel Clock. It was not a machine, it was a sarcophagus of a promise. 20 years ago, on a night as bitter as this one, Elias had held his wife Ethel's hand as her pulse slowed to a final, agonizing stop. Her last words hadn't been a goodbye, but a whisper that haunted every gear he turned. Find the rhythm, Elias. Find the moment where we never have to say goodbye. Every evening, when the gas lamps outside began to flicker, Elias would perform a ritual that no apprentice was ever allowed to see. He would take a silken cloth and polish the blank face of the Bloodwood clock for exactly 1 hour. He didn't use a watch to time himself. He used his own heartbeat. To the world, he was a lonely old man obsessed with a broken toy. But to Elias, he was a guardian. He was waiting for a specific celestial alignment, a moment predicted by a secret set of astronomical charts hidden beneath the floorboards. The people of London rushed past his door, chasing money, chasing fame, chasing the future. They didn't understand that time wasn't a straight line for Elias Thorne. To him, time was a circle, and he was searching for the exact point where the circle closed. He knew that somewhere within the silent, hidden gears of the Aethel Clock lay the power to bridge the gap between 1815 and the golden afternoon of 1795, before the fever, before the silence, before the world turned gray. He was a man possessed by the impossible, a watchmaker trying to mend a broken soul with gears of memory. As the fog pressed against the windows like a living shroud, Elias sat at his workbench, the light of a single candle dancing in the brass reflections. He was working on a pocket watch belonging to a duke, but his mind was on the Bloodwood clock. He could feel the gears of the universe shifting. The stars were moving into position.
The promise was no longer a distant hope. It was becoming a vibration in the air.
Silence was Elias's only companion until the arrival of Julian. Julian was a young man from the docks, orphaned by the sea, with a mind that moved faster than a tourbillon escapement. He had been sent to Elias by a charity house, a boy with nothing but a hunger for knowledge. At first, Elias treated him like a piece of furniture, useful for sweeping up brass shavings, but unworthy of the secrets of the craft. But Julian had a gift. He could hear the music of the machines, just as Elias could. One rainy afternoon, while Elias was out sourcing rare springs, Julian did the forbidden. He approached the Aethel Clock. He noticed that the wood wasn't just polished, it was etched with microscopic lines that only became visible when the light hit at a specific angle. These weren't decorations, they were calculations. Julian realized that the clock's internal mechanism was connected to a series of copper wires that ran into the very foundation of the building, acting as a lightning rod for something far more subtle than electricity. When Elias returned and found Julian staring at the clock, his rage was cold and sharp. "That is not a timepiece, boy. It is a tomb. Do not touch what you cannot comprehend," he shouted, his voice cracking with a vulnerability Julian had never seen. But Julian didn't flinch. "It's not a tomb, Master Thorne," Julian replied softly. "It's a map. You're not trying to tell the time. You're trying to calculate the weight of a soul in seconds, aren't you?" Elias froze. For the first time in 20 years, someone had pierced the veil of his isolation. He saw in Julian not just a student, but a witness. Over the next several weeks, the dynamic of the shop shifted. Elias began to speak, not in sentences, but in fragments of a lost science. He told Julian about the Chronos key, a theory he had developed with Aethel, who had been a brilliant mathematician in her own right. They believed that if a mechanical device could be tuned to the exact vibration of a person's most intense memory, it could create a localized fold in the fabric of reality. "The world thinks time is an ocean we are drowning in," Elias whispered one night, his face illuminated by the green glow of an alchemical lamp. "But time is a fabric, Julian, and like any fabric, it has a thread. If you find the right thread, you can pull it. You can bring the end back to the beginning." Julian listened, enthralled. He helped Elias recalibrate the internal escapement of the Bloodwood clock, using a liquid mercury balance that Elias had spent a decade perfecting. The complexity was staggering. Every gear had to be hand-ground to 1/1000th of an inch. The friction had to be zero. They worked in a fever dream, fueled by black tea and the desperate hope of an old man. Julian began to realize that the clock was designed to trigger at a very specific moment, the arrival of a great comet that hadn't been seen since the year Aethel was born. The comet was a cosmic clock hand, and it was fast approaching. But as they worked, the shop began to change. Clocks that hadn't been wound in years started ticking in reverse. Shadows on the wall stayed still, even when the candles moved. The boundary between the shop and the rest of London was thinning. Elias was no longer just a watchmaker. He was an architect of a miracle, or perhaps a catastrophe. He was gambling his sanity on the belief that a promise made in 1795 was more real than the stone walls of 1815. As the night of the celestial alignment drew near, the atmosphere in the shop became electric. It wasn't just the ticking anymore.
It was a low hum that vibrated in the marrow of their bones. Elias stopped eating. He stopped sleeping. He spent his hours whispering to the Bloodwood clock, his voice a mix of prayer and command. Julian watched as his master seemed to age and grow younger at the same time. The wrinkles on Elias's face would smooth out for moments, as if his body were already flickering between two different points in history. "She's close, Julian," Elias said, his eyes unfocused. "I can smell the lavender she used to wear. I can hear the rustle of her silk dress against the floorboards." Julian grew worried. He saw that the Aethel Clock was starting to consume Elias's life force. The machine required an immense amount of human kinetic energy to breach the temporal barrier. Elias was feeding the gears with his own heartbeat, his own breath. One evening, a mysterious man in a long black cloak entered the shop. He didn't have a watch to fix. He was a collector of forbidden curiosities. He had heard rumors of the Bloodwood clock and offered Elias a fortune for it, enough gold to buy half of London. Elias didn't even look up from his work. "Gold is just yellow metal for people who are afraid of forever," Elias said. "You cannot buy a promise." The man warned him that tampering with the great chain of time would bring a darkness that no light could pierce, but Elias simply pointed to the door. Julian found a hidden journal belonging to Aethel. In it she had written, "If Elias ever finishes the great work, tell him that I am not in the gears, I am in the silence between the ticks." This confused Julian. Was the clock a bridge, or was it a trap? He tried to warn Elias, but the old man was beyond reason. He had waited 20 years for this night. The comet was now visible in the London sky, a streak of ghostly silver cutting through the coal smoke. The night arrived. The shop was a storm of mechanical motion. Every clock in the room was spinning its hands at a frantic pace. The Aethel clock began to glow with a deep, pulsating crimson light, the color of a beating heart. The blank wooden face started to ripple like water. Elias stood before it, his silver tuning fork held high. He wasn't afraid. He was coming home. "Julian, whatever happens, do not stop the pendulum," Elias commanded. "If the rhythm breaks, I am lost between worlds forever." Julian took his place at the heavy lead pendulum, his muscles straining against the unnatural resistance of the air. The room began to tilt. The sounds of 1815, the horses on the street, the shouting of vendors began to fade, replaced by the sound of a summer wind and the distant chirping of birds. The smell of oil was replaced by the scent of fresh rain on grass. Elias stepped toward the rippling face of the clock. He reached out a trembling hand. "Aethel," he whispered. A hand, young and soft, reached out from the wood to meet his. It was a moment of impossible beauty. The gears were screaming now, the brass hot enough to glow. Julian felt the weight of the universe pressing down on him, but he held the rhythm. He saw Elias's face transform. The sadness vanished. The years fell away, and for one heartbeat, he was the young man who had fallen in love in 1795.
The shop was no longer a shop. It had become a cathedral of shimmering light and grinding metal. Julian felt the floorboards beneath his feet vibrating so intensely that he feared the very foundation of Aldgate would crumble. The great comet was now directly overhead, its celestial energy fueling the alchemical mercury within the Aethel Clock. The crimson glow from the Bloodwood casing had turned into a blinding gold, casting shadows that didn't belong to the room. shadows of trees that weren't there, and the silhouette of a woman whose laughter seemed to echo from the very walls. Elias was halfway into the ripple of the clock space. His arm had vanished into the wooden surface, and as Julian watched, the old man's tattered tweed coat began to transform into the fine velvet suit he had worn on his wedding day. The transformation was agonizing yet beautiful. But then the rhythm faltered. A small gear, a tiny brass wheel from a watch Elias had been repairing earlier, fell from the workbench and jammed into the main drivetrain of the great work. The screaming of the metal was deafening. The golden light flickered and turned a sickly, bruised purple. The hand that had reached out to Elias began to recede, the youthful fingers slipping away from his grasp. "No!" Elias roared, his voice cracking with the desperation of 20 years of loneliness. "Julian, the tension! Adjust the counterweights!" Julian lunged toward the base of the clock. The heat radiating from the machine was like a furnace, singeing his hair and blistering his skin. He saw the jammed gear. It was glowing white-hot. He knew he couldn't reach it with his bare hands, and any tool would snap under the pressure. In that moment, Julian realized the true cost of the promise. The clock didn't just need gears. It needed a sacrifice of the present to reclaim the past. He remembered Ethel's journal. "I am in the silence between the ticks." Julian understood now. The machine was trying to bridge 2 points in time, but the now was too heavy. To make the bridge hold, someone had to anchor the present. Julian grabbed the heavy lead pendulum with both hands, using his own body weight to force the rhythm back into alignment. His muscles screamed in protest. His bones felt like they were being crushed by the weight of centuries. As Julian stabilized the beat, the purple tint vanished, and the golden warmth returned. Elias looked back at Julian one last time. In his eyes, there was no longer the madness of a scientist, but the profound gratitude of a father. "Thank you, boy," Elias whispered, though his lips didn't move. He turned back to the ripple, and with a final surging effort, he stepped through. The shop exploded in a silent wave of energy. All the windows shattered outward, but no glass fell to the street. Instead, the shards vanished into thin air. Every clock in the room stopped at the exact same microsecond. The great comet passed its zenith, and the hum that had filled the air for weeks died instantly. Julian fell to the floor, gasping for breath, his hands raw and bleeding. The workshop was plunged into a darkness so deep it felt like being underwater. When Julian finally managed to light a match, his breath hitched. The Aethel Clock was still there, but it was changed. The Bloodwood was no longer dark and ominous. It had turned into a warm, light oak. And for the first time in 20 years, the face was no longer blank. 2 golden hands had appeared, and they were moving. But they weren't moving at the pace of a normal clock. They were moving in a slow, graceful dance, keeping time with a rhythm that felt peaceful. Elias was gone. His workbench was empty, his tools neatly arranged as if he had just stepped out for a moment. But on the stool lay his old charcoal-stained tweed vest. Julian picked it up, and as he moved it, a small silver locket fell from the pocket. Inside was a picture of Elias and Ethel, both young, both smiling, standing under a blooming cherry tree. But there was something different. The date on the back of the photo wasn't 1795. It was 1815. London woke up the next morning to find Thorne's horology strangely altered. The fog had lifted, and for the first time in months, the sun hit the cobblestones of the narrow alley. Julian stood in the doorway, wearing Elias's old shop apron. He looked older, his eyes carrying a weight of wisdom that didn't belong to a young apprentice. He didn't open the shop for business that day, or the next. He had a different task. He spent the following weeks cleaning the shop, not as a servant, but as a curator. He found that every clock Elias had ever touched was now perfectly synchronized. They didn't lose a single second. But the most miraculous thing was the Aethel Clock. It no longer required winding. It didn't need mercury or celestial alignments. It simply ticked, a soft, comforting sound that made anyone who entered the shop feel an inexplicable sense of peace. Word spread through the city about the miracle of Aldgate. People who were grieving, people who had lost their way in the cold rush of the industrial age, began to visit. They didn't come to fix their watches. They came to sit near the oak clock. They claimed that in the silence between its ticks, they could hear the voices of their own lost loves, or feel a warmth that reminded them of a better time. Julian became the new master of the shop. He never told anyone the full story of that night. He knew the world wasn't ready to understand that time is not a prison, but a canvas. He kept Elias's journals hidden, studying them only at night. He realized that Elias hadn't gone back to 1795 to change the past. He had created a sanctuary where 1795 and 1815 existed at the same time. Elias was living his forever with Ethel in a pocket of reality that Julian had helped anchor. One evening, many years later, an old woman entered the shop. She looked at the Aethel clock and tears filled her eyes. "I remember this," she whispered. "My mother told me about the man who loved his wife so much, he taught the wood to breathe." Julian smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "He didn't just teach the wood to breathe, ma'am. He taught us that a promise is the only thing time cannot break." As Julian grew old, he passed the secret down to a new apprentice, a young girl with sharp eyes and a kind heart. He told her about the rhythm, the sacrifice, and the silence. He showed her the silver tuning fork, which still hummed when the wind blew from the east. The shop remained a beacon of hope in a city that was becoming increasingly mechanical and cold. The story of Elias Thorne became a legend, a whispered tale told by watchmakers across Europe. They called it the Old Watchmaker's Promise. It served as a reminder that while the gears of the world will eventually wear down, and the springs of life will lose their tension, the energy of a true, selfless love is a self-winding mechanism. It is the only thing that can truly fix a broken world. On his final night, Julian sat in Elias's old chair. The shop was filled with the rhythmic breathing of 100 clocks. He looked at the Aethel clock, and for a moment, the golden hands flickered. He saw a vision of a field of cherry trees, and two figures walking together into the sunset, a man in a velvet suit and a woman in a silk dress. They stopped and waved at him. Julian closed his eyes, a smile on his face, finally joining the rhythm he had guarded for so long. The shop in Aldgate eventually disappeared, replaced by modern buildings and the relentless march of progress. But some say that if you walk down that narrow alley on a quiet, foggy night in London, and you stop and listen very carefully, you can still hear it. In the silence between the city's noises, there is a soft, steady tick, a reminder that somewhere, in a place the world forgot, a promise is still being kept. Time has a heart, and that heart belongs to those who dare to love beyond the final tick of the clock.